Okay. Again, good morning, everyone. My name is Lauren Wilson. I work at the Ries Hospital within our population health department. Thank you for joining us today for the Stress and Resilience seminar presented by Scott Ries. I'm going to give a little background on Scott and then I will hand it over to him. Scott Ries is the manager of the behavioral health at the Ries Hospital. In that role, he is responsible for the behavioral health consultant component of the CPC Plus. He also has a specialty clinical practice at the Ries Hospital and is a consultant with the Clinically Integrated Network. Previously, he was an assistant professor of clinical psychiatry in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neuroscience at the University of Cincinnati. He has worked in the behavioral health field for more than 38 years as a clinician, teacher, supervisor, and administrator. And with that being said, Scott, I will go ahead and hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to welcome everyone and thanks for joining. I am going to get rid of my face, no loss to the group, and I'm going to add my presentation. So boom, there we go to that. And I got to actually get that to work. No, that's not going to work. So let me get my share screen going here, and then we'll be good to go. And now it's at work. Okay, so what I need to do is, there we go. Okay, now we're rocking, and I'm going to get rid of, let's see here, stop video. Perfect. Okay, so as Lauren said, I've been in behavioral health for a very long time, and over the years have primarily done research on stress and the effects of stress on health, as well as sort of treated that in a clinical practice. And so what I want to talk about today is stress and resilience as kind of a response to stress. And so the objectives for today are to take a look at what the basics of stress are, including how it develops and the effect that it has on our brains and on our overall health. And then I want to talk about resilience as an appropriate response to stress. That will include self-care strategies that you can hopefully take away from today that are cognitive, behavioral, and to some degree working with mindfulness, although I won't go into that in great detail. So for starters, so what is stress? Okay, stress is an internal response to external demands and not the demands themselves, which is different than what most of us learn when we're growing up. We learn that stress is what happens to us. COVID is a stress, or a difficult job is a stress. And in reality, that's the demand. The stress is how we process it internally. How do we think about it? How do we respond to it? That ends up being the stress. And stress comes in two types, okay? Short-term stress is pretty easily managed and resolved. So short-term stress is like a work deadline, or getting your taxes in on time, or helping your child with a project or something like that, where there's a clear end date, it's going to be reached relatively quickly, and then you get back to normal. Enduring stress is much different. It's very difficult to manage. It leads to burnout, and it's very common in occupational settings. The result of it is for people, and this is coming out of research that we've done, emotional exhaustion, a low sense of personal accomplishment, and cognitive impairment, memory issues, concentration issues, decision-making. And you'll see that in your colleagues who have been under stress, particularly if you work in a hospital setting over the last couple of years. We've seen all of that. People who are committed to healthcare to reach a point where they can't imagine doing that anymore. And so that's all to the enduring stress, that where there doesn't feel like there's an endpoint. And so it never really seems to go away. Okay. So how does stress affect your brain? Well, for starters, our brain evolved over millions of years, but hasn't had much of a change in about the last 40,000 years. And so what that means is the brains that we walk around with now have not had an upgrade in all that time, and they were designed for a world we don't inhabit. Okay, survival was the daily challenge 40,000 years ago. And that's all that we had to worry about 40,000 years ago, is trying to figure out a way to get through the day. So as a result, when your brain reacts to stress, it acts as to all stresses, no matter how minor, as though they were potentially lethal. Okay, so three things happen. Well, the first thing is your sympathetic nervous system, your fight flight response that we all know about, is activated. There's a second thing that happens, which is the activation of your HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, which is what releases cortisol and adrenaline, which kicks off that anxiety and that agitation that we feel when we get stressed. Both of these responses are important for survival when you're in an acutely dangerous situation. For instance, if you're being chased by a bear, this is really helpful stuff to have going on. But it also does a number of different things. It increases your heart rate to better pump blood to your brain. Okay, that's what you'll notice when you're stressed and your heart starts racing. It's trying to get blood to your brain for its use. It narrows your blood vessels. Narrowing your blood vessels helps you not bleed to death, as does increasing your blood's ability to clot. So if you wonder why stress tends to be implicated in things like hypertension and cardiovascular disease, that's why, among other things. It tries to get rid of anything in your system that might be toxic if you're injured. So your appetite goes away because you don't want to be eating at that point. You don't want to be digesting, so your body will actually stop digesting. That leads to GI issues that people sometimes chronically have. And then these last two are important in terms of how you respond to it. The first thing is your breathing changes. You go from breathing using your diaphragm to kind of a shallow breath, which is more effective and useful if I'm running away from something or if I try to fight something. You can't knock the wind out of me if I'm breathing shallow. Okay. The more important thing is it limits my ability to think about anything other than the threat and increasing the tendency to create new threats. Okay. So two things are happening there. One of which is my ability to think about all the other things that people have told me I should do when I'm stressed goes out the window. Okay. Now think about the value of that if you're actually, running from a bear. Okay. You don't want to be looking at the pretty wildflowers and thinking about those or thinking about, okay, so what am I going to have for dinner tonight? You want to think about running away from the bear. And that's the whole point of this. And then you're sort of creating, when you're stressed, all kinds of new threats. Okay. You're wondering whether the bear is closer or whether the dog that might bite you is rabid. You start to create new things in your mind that also impair your ability to think about appropriate solutions. So acute stress leads to action. Running from the bear is action. Well, if I outrun the bear, which is increasingly unlikely the older I get, but if I outrun the bear or if I fight off the danger, I get tired, I get winded. And so my breathing re-regulates naturally. I start breathing diaphragmatically using my diaphragm. And when I breathe diaphragmatically, it activates my parasympathetic nervous system, which is sort of the off switch to the sympathetic nervous system. Okay. However, if I'm chronically stressed, if I have a chronically stressful job, or if I'm dealing with chronic home stressors of some sort, I don't get that opportunity to run or fight. And the result is I have a chronic release of cortisol at a low level, which in turn leads to immune system suppression and leads to chronic inflammation. Okay, now those are very important because those are two of the primary reasons that we get medically ill. Okay, so obviously we want to figure out some way to manage this chronic stress, not get rid of the acute reaction because that's helpful, but we want to get rid of the chronic thing. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a model that gives you a way to think about how a given situation turns into symptoms and behaviors. So if you start with the red box and you look at a situation, one thing to note is that most situations in life are what I think of as meaning neutral. So one person's really stressful traffic jam might be another person's opportunity to listen to music while they're in an environment that's away from work, away from phones, etc. So we give situations meaning through a filter, okay? So the filtering system we use is the next box, the biology and the schemas. So your biology acts as a filter because when I'm anxious or stressed or angry or depressed, my brain doesn't function the same way. So my brain changes in how it processes things. So if I'm depressed, I'm going to tend to filter things in a more pessimistic way than if I'm not depressed. If I'm anxious, I'm going to see threats that might not exist in a way I might not otherwise. So our biology is important. And in my field, one of the ways that we address that is through medication. Medication can help you adjust the biology in a way that helps you then recover, okay? The second thing are these things we call schemas, which are belief systems. Core beliefs are sort of dichotomous. In other words, you can think of yourself as competent or incompetent. You can think of yourself as, likable or not likable. You can think of other people as trustworthy or not. You can think of the world as safe or not, or maybe fair or not. And those core schemas we develop throughout our early life. And then we add conditional schemas. And conditional schemas are if-then statements. If I do this correctly, then I'll be good. If I fail to do this, people will not like me. There's these if-then statements built in. Those all tend to filter situations we're in. And so if I have a dread fear of giving presentations and someone asks me to give a presentation, my filtering system might say, no, you're bad at that, don't do that, and talk me out of it. Or I can address that by saying, yeah, I always tell myself that, so I don't really need to pay attention to that. Let's move on, okay? So our filtering system then leads to the next box, which are what we call automatic thoughts. Automatic thoughts are some of the thousands of thoughts that each of us has every day. And those thoughts tend to come into three forms. Thought number one is true or accurate, meaning that it's a good representation of reality. The second group are inaccurate thoughts. And most, the thoughts that we have are just irrelevant. They're not really inaccurate or accurate. They just don't mean a thing, okay? But the thoughts that affect us are the ones that lead to our emotions, okay? They trigger our depression, our anger, our anxiety, etc. Those emotions then trigger more thinking. So if I'm anxious, or if I start thinking that something's wrong, I'll get anxious, which will in turn lead me to thinking more anxiety-provoking thoughts. And then that leads into somatic symptoms, panic attacks, tremors, those kinds of things, GI symptoms, and behaviors, which are things we choose, okay? So anxiety might lead me to avoid situations, which then tends to make things worse and create new situations. And then the whole model kind of goes over again. And we'll have time for questions at the end of this. So if you got questions about this, I'd be happy to answer them. I know I covered that fairly quickly, but it's kind of a model for how you take a situation and process it through and then create new situations that you then have to process as well. Okay, so disease and stress, we've talked a little bit about, but one of the things is that we know that psychosocial stress, what we normally experience, is a precursor of disease and reduced quality of life. Acute stressors are more likely to cause disease if there's an underlying reactivity to stress from other factors, including job stress, what we call low socioeconomic status, meaning you're struggling for money or to pay bills, or childhood adversity and trauma. So what that means is if you've already got a chronic stress, acute stress is more likely to cause a disease where it might not otherwise. And as I said, systematic low-grade inflammation is probably the cause between stress and resulting disease. We didn't know that 10 years ago. That's something we're really discovering as we do research, that stress creates inflammation, which tends to lead to a number of significant problems and diseases. Okay, so stress also then affects the course and outcome of disease and illness in two ways. The first is the physiological effect, which we just talked about. And the second is stress reduces our ability to think about and do appropriate things to get better. Okay, so what that means is I might, I'm told by a physician or someone else, you need to rest. but my stress is telling me I'm behind at work, so I need to keep, banging away at it and get it done. And that just makes me more stressed and perhaps more ill. The same thing happens if I feel depressed, and one of my responses to being depressed, because depression is in fact a physiological illness, but if I'm depressed and my resulting response to that is I'm going to sit in a room by myself and drink all night, that's probably going to make me more depressed, as opposed to thinking more creatively about what to do about that. So stress affects both the course of disease and then how we deal with it. So let's talk a little bit about resilience. So what do we do about this stress that comes up? Okay, well, resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. And I use this picture in part because this is a picture that in some ways demonstrates resilience to the nth degree. So this is a library in London in 1940 that, as you see, had its roof bombed in by the Germans during the Blitz. And it opened the next day. And there were people, looking at books through the library because the library was still open, despite the fact that there's all the rubble in the middle. The British government published a lot of pictures like this and distributed them worldwide to demonstrate how resilient the population was to what they were dealing with. That for the most part, and I've met people who went through the Blitz during some of the times I've been in London, and one of the things I've learned is that people went on with their lives. They went, into the shelters at night, they endured the bombing, and the next day they went back to work, which is kind of amazing to think about, given how life-threatening everything was. So resilience is just recovering quickly from difficulties. And as I think about resilience, and as I've talked to people about how they deal with things, I've had 4 things that have come up that make the most sense to me that contribute to resilience. And we'll talk about each of these. Okay. The first thing is acceptance. Okay. We're going to talk about that more, as I said. So acceptance. The second is flexibility. The third is something I call decatastrophizing, which is kind of an awkward word, but I'll describe what that means in a minute. And then the fourth is an internal locus of control, which is just basically the belief that I have some effect on the outcome of things in my own life, that I'm not totally in the control of others or the outside world. So let's start with acceptance. And when I think about acceptance, I think about what I call the 2 worlds conundrum, okay? We all live in 2 worlds, okay? We live in me world. And me world is that world inside our head that consists of shoulds and oughts and musts and our assumptions and our expectations. And then we live in the world, okay? The world is the reality that you actually have to function in. It's the world that you share in this country with 325 million other me worlds, okay? So I have a way that I think the world should be. It's my, I think of that as my make me God for a day and I'll make some changes kind of world. But then I have to deal with the real world, okay? And that's where our distress comes oftentimes from a misalignment of these 2 worlds. Okay, what that means is if I think something should be happening a certain way and it's not, I can get distressed. Acceptance is a willingness to deal with the world as it is rather than as we wish it would be. But very importantly, that doesn't mean I have to like it or that I agree with it or that I have to give up on changing it. It just means that in this moment, I need to accept it. So for most of you, you have to accept the reality that you need to work a job in order to pay your bills, because most of us are not trust fund babies or lottery winners. So, accepting that means, okay, I'm going to make the best of the fact that I need to go to work every day. Okay, and try to make the best of that. We deal with that when we have kids and we're raising kids, that our kids don't end up being mini-me's. They end up having their own personalities and their own wishes and desires, and they don't do what we tell them all the time, okay? Accepting that is just a willingness to deal with it and not act like it doesn't exist. So acceptance is very important because unless I'm accepting the reality of things, I can't fix anything because I'm not seeing it properly. Okay, so what about flexibility? So flexibility is the capacity to find and accept alternatives in a given situation quickly. Okay. And it just means that it allows me to move to my plan B when plan A doesn't work. One of my first clinical supervisors once told me that when I'm working with somebody, you should have kind of a list of things that you can offer and fail quickly. If something's not working, move on. Don't just assume that if I keep beating that particular dead horse, it will work, because it won't. Okay. So you want to move on quickly. And that's all flexibility really is this isn't working. Let's move on to something that might work. If that doesn't work, let's move on to something else. Because people get locked into their behaviors and their habits and patterns that don't work very well for them. They say they want to make a change in their life, but they won't change the things that are contributing to the problem because they can't get outside. They can't be flexible to change their diet if they want to lose weight, or quit drinking if they want to affect that problem or something else. So, okay, third thing, decatastrophizing. So in times of stress, our brains use our limbic system. Your limbic system is the part of your brain that controls your emotion and your threat responses. It's a series of structures right inside your brain, covered by the rest of it. So you can't see it from the outside. But it uses our limbic system for reacting rather than the part of our brain we're so proud of, which is our prefrontal cortex, because our prefrontal cortex is what makes us human. It's our ability to create iPhones and put people in space and that sort of thing. That comes from our prefrontal cortex. All other mammals have cortexes, but they don't have nearly as developed a prefrontal cortex as we have, which is why they don't create iPhones. Okay. What happens then is we create a lot of dangers in our mind that may or may not exist. Okay. Most of the things you have worried about in your life, I would go on to say, are things you made up in your mind that were never going to happen. Think about what you worried about when you were in high school. Think about all the things that you worried about. Now look back and try to figure out how many of those did you really need to worry about. Okay. So decatastrophizing is the ability to confront rather than to avoid a problem, particularly when the problem is mostly imagined. Okay. And so I'll give you an example of this, and I'll talk a little bit about how I handled it in the next slide. But a couple of years ago, my wife and I went to London, actually 3 years ago, it was 2019, before everything shut down. My wife and I went to London to visit a friend of mine. And I got to the airport, and it was a very long flight over. And I turned out that I left my passport on the plane. So I'm walking towards customs and I don't have a passport, right? So you begin to catastrophize. I don't have a passport. Uh-oh, what happens now, kind of a thing. And so I worked with something I call the downward arrow. And this is the way I teach people to decatastrophize things. One of the problems with an imaginary problem is that because it doesn't exist, I can't use my problem solving skills to fix it. I use the example that if my roof is actually leaking, I can do something about that. I can call a roofer, I can fix it myself. If I'm just worried my roof will leak, I can't do anything about that because it's not a problem I can fix. And so using a downward arrow is just doing a mental exercise where you decide that what you're worried about actually happens. So I assume what's going to happen. If that were to happen, then what? So in my case, what I said is, okay, I'm going to get here and they're not going to be able to find my passport. And I'm going to be sitting in this airport without a passport. So that's the sort of thing that I was most worried about. So the question, if that were to happen, then what? And in that moment, I'm going to choose a possible outcome. And I can choose to either use a worst case scenario, or I can choose the most likely. So in the case of not having a passport, the worst case scenario is I'm arrested and they take me to some prison in London, and that's my vacation, right? A more likely scenario is they don't really want to arrest me and they don't really want me sitting in the airport for the rest of my life. So they have some process for getting me out the door, okay? So I settled on that as the most likely outcome. But then another thing pops up. Well, my friend's going to be circling the airport waiting for us to come out because he doesn't want to spend money on parking. Well, if that were to happen, then what? Well, that happens, I'm going to call him and tell him, find a parking spot and I'll pay for your parking because I can afford that. So, that fixes that problem. And then it becomes, well, now what am I going to do? I'm in London. I don't have a passport. I have to have one to get back on a plane to go home. Then what? Well, there's an embassy in London. So what that might mean is I spend a day of my vacation sitting in an embassy waiting to get my passport reissued. Again, I don't like any of these outcomes, but I can tolerate them all. And you keep repeating that until you get to the point where you say, okay, if that happens, can I deal with that? Well, yeah, I can deal with that. So I don't have a catastrophe on my hands anymore. And you can use that with a wide range of things, including illnesses. What happens if I get COVID? And you work through that. Because in the end, what you're going to find is by approaching it as a problem to be solved, most, if not all of you, probably are pretty good problem solvers. So make it a problem that you can solve in your mind to get to something so that if it actually did happen, you're ready to go. So that's decatastrophizing using the downward arrow. Okay. Last thing we're going to talk about here is locus of control. So having an internal locus of control, as I mentioned, is positively correlated with resilience, even after trauma. People who go through trauma, who believe they have some ability to affect their own lives, do much better with the outcome than people who don't. Okay, we see that in people who are POWs, in people who go through natural disasters, etc. An external locus of control, where basically you're assuming that I'm controlled by my environment or other people, is implicated clearly in the development of depression, anxiety, and something that I used to research called functional neurologic illness, which is tremors and seizures and things like that that are caused by stress. An external locus of control is highly correlated in the development of those illnesses. Okay. So those are the 4 elements of resilience. And so we're going to talk a little bit about specific things you can do to affect those. Okay. For the first thing, I'm going to go back a little bit to the locus of control. I teach something called the circles of control. And the circles of control is something that I developed when I was working a lot with nurses during COVID around their stresses, and realized that a lot of people are visual learners, not verbal learners. So this is kind of a visual cue that I came up with just to help illustrate the issues of control. And the first one is you have this small circle called control, and it's the smallest of your circles. What you can actually control in your life isn't much, okay? Your next circle is what you can influence, okay? Parenting, to be honest with you, after a certain point, is mostly about influence, not control. If you keep thinking you're controlling your adolescents, you're going to be really frustrated. If you realize you're influencing them, it gets a little easier, okay? So we can influence more than we can control. But then there's this third circle, which is I can't control or influence, but it affects my life. So for some people, your job is like that. You really don't have any control or influence over what goes on, but it obviously affects your life, okay? The weather is like that. I can't control whether it snows or it's cold, but I can own coats and snow shovels so that I can at least do something about that. And that's the goal of this circle, is it affects my life. And so is there anything in this that I can control? So in my job, it might be that, the job is so bad, I need to find something else. Or it might be that just changing how I think about the work that I'm doing may be all I need to do to change how I feel about it. But the whole goal of this is, since I can't control or influence, I want to find something that I might be able to control. Okay. And then there's this huge fourth circle, which is things that I don't control or influence, but in reality don't have any effect on my life at all. And I want you to think about politics that way, because as anybody who's ever done any work in Washington, and I did for a bit, will realize is that nobody in Washington knows you are alive or cares. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about politics, but we actually have no control or influence. And most of us, it doesn't really affect our daily life to any great degree. Okay. We affect our own lives more than politics does. Okay. Sports is like that. I'd like the Reds to win, but doesn't look like that's going to happen a whole lot, but it really doesn't have any effect on my practical daily life. Okay. So those are your 4 circles of control, but let's look at the important things. So number 1, where do you spend your energy? Because obviously what you'd like to do is spend your energy starting in control and then working your way out so that you're spending almost no energy on that fourth circle. Okay, cable news will be very upset if you choose that, because cable news is all about getting you to care about things you can't do anything about and presenting narratives to you. And a lot of the people I've seen over the last several years come in with stress related to the news they consume, or again, other things that are related to sports, for instance, caring, about what the Reds are doing, etc. But where you spend your energy has a lot to do with your stress level. People who spend their energy in the center and then work their way out tend to be a lot less stressed than people who start spending their energy on the outside and then work their way in. So that's kind of the point of the circles of control. So let's talk about cognitive strategy. So, cognitive strategy is, we've talked a little bit about, but the whole idea of a cognitive strategy is you can notice what you're thinking. You can pay attention to what you're telling yourself. So when I'm stressed, what am I thinking? And is it accurate or distorted? If it's accurate, I want to problem solve. Okay. If there's an actual problem, I don't want to change how I'm thinking. I want to solve the problem, and that will change my thinking automatically. But if it's distorted, I need to change the thought to better reflect reality. And I've got two quotes here from American history. One of them is by William James, who said, "Our greatest control over stress is the ability to choose one thought over another." And Abraham Lincoln once said, "Most people are about as happy as they make up their minds to be." So how do we change distorted thoughts? Well, first of all, we have to figure out what is a distorted thought. Here's a short list of some of the ways we just all distort our thinking. Catastrophizing, we've talked about. A lot of us do a lot of mind reading. We think we know what someone's thinking about us when we really don't, or what they're assuming about us when we really don't. Fortune telling is about predicting the future. I'm not going to apply for that job because I wouldn't get it anyway. Okay. Should statements are the assumption that, somebody should or shouldn't be doing something that they're doing, or that we shouldn't be doing what we should be doing. And again, that fits in with that whole kind of two worlds idea. What if statements are sort of thinking of all the bad things that can happen. I'm sniffling, but I don't want to take the COVID test because what if I've got COVID? The what if gets in the way of a lot of that. And then all or nothing thinking, which is a lot of getting caught into perfectionism and the idea that any flaw means I have failed, as opposed to none of us are perfect. We all make mistakes all the time, and that we get through those and we manage those. Okay. So that's the sort of, when you notice you're making some mistakes, by definition, you want to change that thought. So what about behavioral strategies? Okay. So here are some common responses, but that aren't very healthy to stress. Okay. Alcohol and substance abuse, we've talked about. The businesses that did really, really well during COVID were liquor stores and, streaming services, because, liquor stores sold us alcohol, and emotional attachment from others came oftentimes from, I'm just going to veg out in front of the television. And so detaching from others is not a healthy response, but it's a normal response. So you have to kind of watch out for it. Compulsive behaviors, eating too much, gambling, pornography, other substance uses go into compulsive behaviors. And then escape. Escape is sort of assuming that if I leave my job prematurely or another situation prematurely, that's going to fix the problem. Okay. I'm going to tell you right now that avoidance and escape make almost every problem worse, unless you have accurately assessed that that's the only option you have. If you're in a very toxic relationship and you've assessed it properly, getting out of it is a good thing. Same with a really toxic job. But most people bail on things far too early, assuming that the grass is always greener on the other side. And so these are the kinds of things that people tend to do almost automatically when they're stressed, but all these things make stress worse over the long haul. So what are some positive things? Okay, the first thing that I teach is something called behavioral activation, which is basically just taking control. Okay, behavioral activation is, I'm going to identify something that's valuable. So that might be, I want to get healthy. That might be, I want to learn new skills. It might be, I want to spend more time with my family or with friends. You identify the valued goal, you define some steps to reach that goal. But then most importantly, assume you're not going to want to do it and do it anyway. I have people often tell me, yeah, I would like to go to the gym, but I just can't talk myself into it. Okay. Having gone to the gym a lot in my life, I've never wanted to go to a gym ever in my life. Okay. I never want to get out of bed at 5:45 to go to a gym. I do it because I like how I feel when it's done. So the goal is anything that I do, I'm not going to necessarily be motivated to do, but if I do it anyway, the chances are good that the motivation will follow that and it won't precede it. And so when I'm leaving the gym, I'm a really happy guy. Okay. Not so much when I'm going, but when I'm leaving, I'm a very happy guy. Same with, cutting the grass or cleaning a bathroom or something. We don't really have to want to do those things. We do them anyway. And then we feel better when they're done. Okay. So behavioral activation is just working towards a goal and working through the resistance to get the payoff. Okay. Breathing is another strategy behaviorally. And because as we talked about earlier, we tend to breathe shallow when we're stressed. And some people don't realize that they spend most of their day breathing in the upper part of their lungs, not using their diaphragm. So breathing using your diaphragm throughout the day is a very helpful way to cut your stress down. It'll do something physiological for you, but it will also slow you down. Okay, exercise, very helpful thing to do. Exercise is probably the best stress reducer that we've come up with because exercise is actually having your body do what your brain's telling it to do. It's tiring it out. And again, exercise doesn't have to mean going to a gym or doing something extreme. It can be, I'm going to walk the dog, at a decent pace, or I'm going to, walk to the mailbox rather than driving, that kind of a thing. It doesn't have to be intense. It just has to be active. And then meditation, mindfulness, and yoga are things that help some people. Other people don't like them so much, but they tend to work pretty well because they slow you down and they do focus very much on breathing and on recognizing how your thoughts come and go, right? So I'm just going to talk a little bit about mindfulness, which a lot of people out there probably are practicing, which is great. Mindfulness is paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, non-judgmentally. That comes from John Kabat-Zinn, who's done a lot of the research on mindfulness and healthcare. It includes, but isn't limited to formal meditation. And I put that in there because I have people who say, well, I would really like to be more mindful, but I don't have an hour a day to meditate. You don't need to have an hour a day to meditate. You can be mindful while you're eating your lunch. You can be mindful while you're taking a shower or taking a walk. It just means paying attention in the present moment. And the focus of mindfulness is on acceptance of all experiences, including the unpleasant rather than avoidance. And acceptance just means I'm going to accept that this is happening. I don't have to like it, but I'm going to accept that it's the reality of my life. Now, obviously, this is just touching on mindfulness. There's a lot of really good material out that's self-help, geared towards self-help for mindfulness that I would direct you to if that's something that you wanted to do. So, all right. Last of these slides is just talking about practice. Okay. If you want to become more resilient, you need to change from reacting to responding. Okay. Reaction is the first thing that comes to mind. Responding is adding some thinking to that. Okay. It takes daily practice to do that. Okay. That's not something you can pull out of a hat just when you're stressed. You really got to work on that. Assume that change will take time and that you'll have days when you relapse into old habits. So maybe you've gotten into a habit where you're going to the gym 3 times a week, and then you have a morning where you just can't do it. Okay, fine. That's a relapse. No problem. When it happens, just acknowledge it and recommit. Okay. Relapses happen every time you're trying to change. It doesn't represent failure. It represents an old habit reestablishing, and you just recommit to the change. So maybe you're eating a healthy diet, and then you go to a friend's house and you eat in ways that you're telling yourself you shouldn't eat. Fine, enjoy it. The next day, get back to doing what you need to do. Okay. And that's important because practice is the only way you change. If you want to learn any skill, you got to practice. Okay. You learn an instrument by practicing every day. You learn a sport by practicing every day. The same thing happens with behavioral change. And for the last slide, I'm just talking about a little bit about the behavioral health resources that we have at Christ Hospital. In addition to the inpatient unit, we have behavioral health consultants who are available in most of the primary care offices in the Christ system. All you need to do to get onto their schedule is contact your primary care provider's office, and they will schedule that. Okay, you don't need to find that person. You just say, I'd like an appointment with them. Your primary care office will put a referral in and actually schedule while you're on the phone. And then outpatient behavioral health, outside of the behavioral health consultants, we have a couple of options. We have an intensive outpatient service that Scott Bressler, who's a psychologist I worked with extensively at UC, who's now with Christ, runs. It does both mental health and chemical dependency. And there's the phone number for it. And then I provide non-intensive outpatient services through the Christ Hospital as well. And that's my phone number there. So that's the end of the formal presentation. And I promised Lauren that I would leave time for questions, which I suspect there will be some of. So I'm going to stop with that.
Thank you, Scott. Yes, everyone, if you do have questions, you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box. You can open that up and that will allow you to submit your questions. We did have someone ask if this will be recorded and if the presentation will be sent out. Yes, it will. It does take me a little time to transfer this over to Vimeo so I can actually send the link in an email format, or else the presentation itself is too long. So I'll be sure to send that out to everyone once we have that completed. All right, our next question is, how did the passport issue work out, Scott?
Well, I'm here, so obviously I didn't spend time in a dungeon in London. They found it, and which I assumed they would, because I knew where my seat was. I had a boarding pass, and when you fly across the Atlantic, they have to clean and fuel the plane, so it's going to be there for a few hours. So all I had to do is I was sitting there with my wife, who just really wanted a cup of coffee, and I told her, I kept telling her, you can go, and she didn't. So we sat there. I felt really bad about that, but then, we picked up and I had a vacation and it worked out great. So, if you forget your passport in Heathrow Airport, people are very nice and they help you. That's the take home message there.
Thank you, Scott. We have another question that came in. You mentioned self-help material. Is this available online?
There's a lot of self-help stuff. There's online, there's a number of things that you can get through the usual suspects, WebMD, etc. You can Google almost anything and get information. That's everything from things universities publish to, other centers. Depressions, there's a national network of depression centers, for instance, that has a very good website with a lot of self-help stuff for that. There's also a lot of books that you can, I'm a big believer in bookstores. I like browsing. There's, if you think about the self-help section of a bookstore, it's huge now. And so there's things on managing anxiety and depression and anger and stress. So there's a lot of those kind of materials out there that are written to be used, and they have exercises in them that you can work on yourself. So yeah, there's a lot of material out there.
Great, thank you, Scott. One of our other questions we had submitted, any recommendations on how to practice responding to stress when your peers are also feeling stress and reacting instead?
Okay, so some of that is, think about yourself as the model. Okay, and so if I go into a situation like that, where my other people are going to be reacting around me, and I'm, feeling inclined to react along with them, I have to sort of be prepared for that. I have to know what I'm walking into. So if I know, for instance, that I'm going to have a meeting with a couple and one of them is going to be very angry and blow up, and my reaction might be to get angry in return, I need to be prepared for that and think through, how is my response going to be? And so one of the things that I've done for years with, actually even with my kids when they were growing up, but I do a lot with staff, is I ask the question, help me understand. And when I say help me understand, what that means is, you're reacting in a certain way. Help me understand what you're concerned about here. Help me understand how what we're doing is going to make things better. It's less aggressive than what are you thinking, but it sort of gets a discussion going, because all you're really trying to do when people are reacting is slow them down and add a thinking step. I want to throw a thought in there somehow. This is going on. So, and on inpatient units of hospitals, you're often dealing with a sick person and very difficult family members. We've done a lot of that kind of work over the last couple of years, particularly with staff. And, part of it is the family member is demanding or sometimes even abusive. And our normal reaction is to want to be defensive, but that doesn't help very much. And so preparing for it is important, but also sort of thinking through a strategy for, I'm going to slow my own thinking down and see if that will model for other people how to respond. I think that happens. I think you've probably had situations all in your own lives where things seemed really stressful and whoever was leading was calm and people attached to that calmness. And, that's really the best way to do it, is think through how you're going to want to respond to that and then stick with that, no matter how, sort of what comes up internally. Hopefully that helped as an answer.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, I think that was helpful. Another question that came in is, what would you recommend as a first step to get started on this path? This is something that's new to many.
Okay. The first and the most important thing to be able to do is stop long enough when you're feeling stressed to see what's going on. What am I thinking about right now? What am I telling myself? What am I reacting to that may not be an accurate way of thinking about things? So dealing with the reality is really a first step. What's really happening here? And begin to think about those circles of control. Okay, is there anything in this situation that I can directly control right now? And then what can I do about it? That brings in behavioral activation. That's important to me. I'm going to start working on that. Okay. But the first step is always to get out of whatever mode that you've been in if you're chronically stressed that isn't working. Because if you're chronically stressed, whatever you're doing isn't working. And so you want to stop for a moment and say, what am I telling myself? One of the things I consistently tell myself in life is that I'm running late. I grew up in a household where my parents hated being late for things. And so we were always being pushed, don't be late, don't be late, don't be late. I don't like being late for things. The reality is I'm almost never late for anything. I always leave in plenty of time. There's the rare traffic jam that holds me up. But even then, I'm sometimes not late because I leave early enough. But the reality is in my life is there really isn't much late. I mean, if I've, catching a plane or going to a play are kind of the only two things where being late really matters anymore. I mean, if I show up to work 10 minutes late because I got stuck in traffic, chances are somebody's going to wait for me or they might be late too. And so you have to sort of notice a lot of my stress came from you're running late, you're running late. And when I recognized that, I was able to go, you're not really running late for anything. There really isn't a whole lot of late in my life right now. And when I got a hold of that dropped my stress level. Okay. So the first step, if you're going to do anything, is just know what you're dealing with and how your thinking is going and how that affects the stress that's happening, and then start working on dealing with that.
Great. Thank you, Scott. Another question we have is, do you have suggestions or assistance on bereavement-related stress?
Bereavement-related stress.
Yes.
In some ways, it's both easier and harder than other chronic stresses because we find that bereavement does go away. People generally grieve for a period of time and then get better. Not always, but usually. But it's also a more difficult stress because bereavement is about loss, and loss brings into play sadness, depression, anxiety, sometimes anger. We saw a lot of that during COVID of, people who died in the hospital, and there was anger about the fact that they died alone, or anger about the fact that they hadn't been vaccinated and they got sick and died. So there's a lot of very complex emotions when you're doing bereavement. I mean, I think some of that is recognizing that bereavement isn't the same thing as depression. It's not a mental illness. So allow yourself to be sad. Okay. Sadness is normal when we're grieving. Okay. There is no time limit on it. There is no, and if you need to take time from work to clear your head, do that. But then start getting back to life as best you can, because people get stuck sometimes in grieving to the point where they shut everything down for an extended period of time. And then the grieving tends to feed itself because they're detached. I'm not going to work again today because I'm grieving, which is a depressing thought. Okay. So when, I've had those kinds of things happen in my life, and at this point in my life, I've lost a lot of relatives, etc. The bereavement has to do with, no, I'm supposed to be sad now and it's okay. But as soon as I'm really able to start getting back into a rhythm, I'm going to try to start getting back in a rhythm, even knowing that I'm not going to feel the same. I had a parent die when I was a teenager, and it was right before school started for my senior year. It took a while to get through that. And I didn't assume I was going to be the same kid that I was when I was a junior, but it worked out okay. And through doing that, you start to live your life again, and that gets us past bereavement. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you. Scott, we had another question come in. You have listed several resources for outpatient behavioral health. What is the availability of your providers? Our employees have a real issue with access to care in this space.
Yes. Okay. So that's a great question. In our system, if you have a Christ Hospital provider, your availability for accessing one of the behavioral health consultants is rapid. We usually try to get people in within a week or two of the time that they would call. Sometimes we can do same day if there's an opening. And the whole point of the behavioral health program in primary care was to improve that access. Okay. I limit my referrals to my outpatient practice at this point in order to continue to be able to get people in within relatively quick periods of time. A couple weeks, 2, 3. I've got a vacation coming up next week, so it's I'm booking out about 3 weeks now. In the community, I'm looking at wait lists of anything from a month to 6 months or longer, because there's too few people doing what I do, and too many people trying to access. I think having a good EAP is helpful. I'm a big believer in the idea of having that every company of size having an EAP that you can access, because frankly, most people don't need a lot of help. They, if they get what they need in a few sessions, they're good to go. But access is always going to be a problem to some degree. We've tried to make that better, and it's worked thus far, but it all depends on the volume. So, you have a network with your insurance. I'm going to tell you that the list that they give you is all but useless, because it doesn't tell you, first of all, who is retired, who has left the network. They don't update those very often. And it doesn't tell you who's not taking new people. And so, you can get the list, but it doesn't necessarily help. There's a list through Psychology Today that you can use to filter that sometimes helps, because people will often post their availability on that list because they can update it consistently. So that might be another one. Again, psychologytoday.com, and you can find a provider list through that. I wish I could tell you that everybody could get mental health treatment within a week of asking for it, but I don't think it's ever going to be that way. So.
Okay. I think that wraps up our questions, which is perfect timing. We had a lot of great comments in the chat box too. Thank you guys for your feedback. We appreciate that and value that. Scott, everyone says that you're wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. It's what I aim for if I have a choice. So,
Okay, well, thank you again, Scott. Everyone,
thank
thanks
you.
for joining us today. I will send a follow-up email to all those that attended and provide the link so you can watch us again and send this on to your employees. You can watch this with your family at home, whatever you would like. I think there was so much great information in it. So again, thank you, Scott.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
All right, everyone have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.